and let's talk about I guess the first thing we should probably do is sort of set the stage for this decision. What was the genesis of how it ended up at the Supreme Court?
Well, there were 6 lawsuits seeking to block it. Several of them were denied for a lack of legal standing, but 2 of them survived. And in one case, the U.S. Department of Education appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the other case, it seemed likely that it would be appealed. So the 2 cases were granted certiorari by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Danielle, how many people could this potentially affect?
About more than 40 million Americans would be eligible for Biden's student loan program. About 26 million had already applied before it was shut down because of the courts. And I think 16 million had already had their applications approved by the Department of Education.
And Danielle, one of the things that we've been talking about throughout the course of this term of the Supreme Court is how this rightward-leaning court has almost in many ways redefined American jurisprudence through some of the decisions that it has taken. We've seen that redefining of American jurisprudence through its decisions on abortion, its decisions on guns, and yesterday, of course, with the decision on affirmative action. What is your sense of how the court might decide this particular case?
Well, there's a great sense that the program might be struck down if it is ruled on the merits. There's a lot of question about whether or not the president has unilateral authority to sideswipe, I guess, the Congress, who really operates the purse for this country, in order to push forth a program that is over $400 billion in cancellation. But there is a good chance that the program might be upheld because neither of these plaintiffs have standing to prove harm from this program. And if that is the case, then this would go forward. Now, even if the court were to approve the program and uphold it, there are other cases, as Mark had mentioned, that could stand to threaten any future programs if it were to go forth. So I don't think that whatever happens today is the end. If the court strikes it down, I do suspect there will be continued pressure from activists and liberal lawmakers for the White House to come up with an alternative plan. So this isn't going to be the end of this policy or of this fight.
Mark, what are your expectations?
I think it's going to be a 5-4 decision, but I won't tell you whether it's going to be in favor or against, because it's really going to be down to the wire. I count at least 4 justices who think that Missouri lacks legal standing, so just one justice will flip it one way or the other.
And Danielle, the plan that President Biden proposed would eliminate up to $20,000 of federal debt for borrowers, federal student debt for borrowers that earn up to $125,000 or up to $250,000 for married couples. Describe the opposition that we saw politically. I mean, we're talking here legally, the challenges that the justices will be wrestling with. But what were some of the political discussions that came up in anticipation of this going to the Supreme Court?
I think you heard from a lot of people about whether this was fair, right? Now, certainly while there are many Americans who have began college, have college degrees, and certainly have student loan debt, it is not a vast percentage of the American adult population. And there is a question about whether or not taxpayers should shoulder the burden for people who avail themselves of higher education. So that was one big argument. The other one was, while this would help 40 million people alleviate some of their debt burden, it does nothing to address the larger overarching issues and problems of the existing student loan system. And to that, I think the Biden administration kept saying, well, we have other policies in place, such as the creation of a new income-driven repayment program that offers a much more generous pathway to student debt cancellation for people who are making payments. And that is one way that we can try to fix this broken program that precedes us. But either both of those complaints and those criticisms still stand. And I think what's striking to see is, in recent months, there has been an effort in Congress to strike down Biden's plan. That resolution passed Congress. The president vetoed it, but still, I think it gives us a clear sense that there's not enough congressional support to use that as a path for this particular policy. So it's going to be a struggle to continue this fight to get widespread student debt relief.
So, Mark, the Supreme Court heard this decision or heard this case earlier this year. Anything outstanding during that time?
Well, I think that Solicitor General Prelogar did an outstanding performance. She may have swayed one or two justices to the federal government side. She was incredibly well prepared for the arguments. And I think it really is going to hinge on whether the plaintiffs have legal standing. There's this concept of third-party standing, whether the state of Missouri can bring a lawsuit on behalf of Mohila when Mohila itself didn't bring a lawsuit and seems perhaps to not want to get involved.
So, the other thing that's sort of interesting, Danielle, is the Biden administration has pointed to a 2003 law, the HEROES Act, that was actually put into place after the 9/11 attacks that was intended for relief in the wake of that attack. The Trump administration used the HEROES Act themselves to put that pause on student loan payments during the pandemic. And that's what the Biden administration is saying gives them the authority to do so in this case. But help people understand the reasoning of the administration.
Well, certainly the idea here was that the pandemic took a financial toll on millions of Americans, at least, especially in the first few years of which people were sidelined from their jobs, having to stay home, having to try to figure out how to make ends meet, having borrowers have to make these payments, which on average are anywhere between up to $300 for a lot of folks, was an extra added burden that the Trump administration initially and the Biden administration agreed should be alleviated through the pause on payments. Now, the Biden administration decided to take it a step further and say that if we want to help people get a fresh start back into the economy as it is coming out of this pandemic, it would make sense to alleviate some of their debt burden. There are millions of people for whom student loans is a crushing weight. And if the administration could do anything to try to ease that, why not try to make this an effort? Now, to be fair, Biden wasn't always on board with this idea. I think we saw a lot of vacillating as to whether or not this would be not only good for the economy or whether he could have had the authority to do it. But once he was in on this, he was all in on this. So that's another reason why I don't think even if the court strikes this down, this is the end of this fight.
All right. Well, we are just moments away from getting that decision in just a few minutes. And we're keeping an eye there, of course, on the Supreme Court. So Danielle, Douglas, Gabriel, Mark Kantrowitz, just stand by. We're going to thank you for now while we take a quick break. But stay with us as we await this court's decision on President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. We'll be right back.
If it's important to our nation,
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
it's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship
with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, we're going to tell you about that too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Now one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
All right, if you're just joining us, we're following some breaking news from the Supreme Court. The justices ruled in favor of the Colorado web designer who says her religious beliefs prevent her from taking on same-sex couples as clients. Right now, we are still awaiting the court's decision on President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. So let's bring back to the conversation Danielle Douglas-Gabriel. She's a higher education reporter for the Washington Post. And let's bring in Mark Kantrowitz. He's an expert on student loans and an author who has written several books on the subject. So Danielle, just taking a step back, I mean, I think for a lot of people, there's a bigger, like the macro view of what's happening here is that college in the United States has gotten exorbitantly expensive. I mean, you know, I spent a third of my life in France. As you both probably know, it does not cost what it costs to go to some of the best universities in Europe, what it costs to go to a mid-level university in the United States. And so I think a lot of people see the president's plan, while perhaps coming from a good place, just a symptom of a larger issue that needs to be rectified, which is that costs for college and universities in this country are out of control. Are there any discussions around that?
I mean, certainly, I think if you look at some of the other policies that the administration has proposed, which haven't necessarily been successful yet, but they haven't given up on, like tuition-free 2 years of college for low-income students at not only at community colleges, but also at HBCUs, at minority-serving institutes and stuff. So there is a recognition that certainly the cost of college could be prohibitive for folks who are not, who don't have the money and the financial wherewithal to afford it. And they haven't given up on that, even though it was knocked out of one of the president's more sweeping domestic policy packages last year. I also think, you know, there's a lot of discussion about transparency in college pricing and college outcomes. And we're starting to see that, of course, emerge in a lot of the policies coming out of the Biden administration when it comes to accountability measures. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether that's effective enough to really get colleges to reconsider how they price their education and such, because there's a lot that goes into that price, including the cost of administration, the cost of instruction, the cost of just maintenance and healthcare and all of the things it takes to run a college. But I think we're at a point where a lot of families are very reticent about the cost of college and whether or not a college degree is worth it. And that is putting pressure on institutions to think about cost savings and ways to pass that on to families. I don't know if we're about to see a sea change in how much it costs for your local public institution necessarily, but those discussions have been underway, and I imagine they're going to continue to be ratcheted up as we see enrollment leveling off at a lot of schools and a lot of institutions worrying about what the future will look like for them.
Mark, you said earlier you think this is going to be a 5-4 decision. Can you explain a little bit more why?
Well, there are two aspects to the cases. One is whether the plaintiffs have legal standing, and the other is what the merits of the case. If the plaintiffs don't have legal standing, it doesn't get to the merits phase. I think that on the merits phase, it's going to be focused on the major questions doctrine, and the conservative justices will be unanimous in opposing the president's plan. But at least one justice and maybe two think that the plaintiffs don't have legal standing. And I think that has been the focus of the U.S. Department of Education's efforts with regard to the president's plan. And so we may see a court who would like to strike down it, but they don't have plaintiffs who have legal standing to enable them to do so. That does mean that this decision, if it favors the president's student loan forgiveness plan, may be a very fragile decision, that there might be a future plaintiff who could successfully demonstrate legal standing and thereby lead to the president's plan to be blocked.
And so, yeah, Danielle and Mark, I want you to weigh in on this too. I want to go back to the discussion that we were having about why it costs so much money to go to college now. Just because, it's fascinating to me, and maybe both of you can give our viewers a sense of the history of how tuition has, how the calculations into tuition and what it costs for college, a 4-year degree, have evolved over the years. Because even as far back as, not far, I mean, I'm not that old, but went to college in the mid 1980s, and I went to I did my undergraduate at a state university, and I was an out-of-state student, and even that was not exorbitantly expensive for my parents. I mean, it was pricier than going to a state university here in New York, but I don't think that they looked at it as some insurmountable number that, that I was going to be, or they were going to be paying for the rest of their lives and my life. And it feels like in the last 30 years or so, you're getting almost the same education in some instances. I get that schools have upgraded facilities, and I guess maybe part of the issue is that they're trying to compete. You have even like small local universities trying to compete with some of the bigger schools, some of the, the Ivy Leagues, or some of the top named schools in the country. But can you both describe sort of the evolution? Was there a change or a catalyst or something that took tuition into the stratosphere?
Well, government grants have not kept pace with increases in college costs. That shifts the burden of paying for college from the government to the families. But family income has been mostly flat for 2 decades. And that forces families to do one of two things. Either they shift their enrollment to a lower cost college, such as from a private college to a public college, or from a 4-year college to a 2-year college, or they borrow more, because student loans are the only form of financial aid that has any degree of elasticity. And that's why we see very steady increases in student loan debt at graduation. But I don't think the problem is the students who graduate. For the most part, they are able to repay their student loans. It's the students who drop out of college that experience the greatest financial difficulty. They're 4 times more likely to default on their student loans, and they represent more than 3/4 of the defaults.
Danielle and Mark, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us as we await the Supreme Court's final decision on President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony DeVolder from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman.
Thank you for joining us on Person to Person.
Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom.
We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job?
I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
French President Emmanuel Macron convened his cabinet for a second crisis meeting in just 2 days today. It comes in response to the most destructive night of protest yet in France. Officials say more than 200 police officers were injured and more than 600 demonstrators were arrested. CBS News foreign correspondent Elaine Cobb reports from Paris.
Protesters launched fireworks at riot police in the suburbs of Paris, torched cars and set buildings on fire as thousands took to the streets for a 3rd night in a row. Police responded in large numbers, with 40,000 deployed in an attempt to restore order. Demonstrators are accusing the police of racism and excessive force after a 17-year-old named Nael, of Algerian-Moroccan descent, was shot at close range by a police officer during a traffic stop. Police allege Nael refused to stop his car. He died from his wounds. The officer who shot Nael has apologized to the family. He's been placed under formal investigation for voluntary homicide. Nael's mother led a march on Thursday demanding justice for her son. Anti-racist activist Tracy Ladji says these things happen when you're French, but with foreign roots. We're not considered French. They only look at the color of our skin.
The summer travel season is headed into high gear with the 4th of July just days away. Travel experts say U.S. vacationers have European travel fever. And China's got some surprising good news as it transitions to renewables. So here to break it all down for us on today's Money Watch International is CBS News correspondent Ramy Inocencio, who's in London watching the flow of money around the world. First to news of the day, where you are, the UK managed to avoid a recession this past winter.
Yeah, that's right, Wendy. And right now, money, as I'm seeing, is flowing into UK stocks. The main benchmark, the FTSE 100, is trading at highs of the day and at highs of the week, in fact. And it's thanks to US data yesterday that was revised and UK data out this morning. The good news is that the British economy grew 0.1% in the first quarter. And I say that and I have to smile because 0.1% obviously isn't that big, but it's better than 0.0 or negative. Check out the current economic growth for all G7 countries here, and you see where the UK as well as the UK stacks up. The US right there in the middle with 0.5% growth. Revised up on Thursday, as I mentioned. The chance of a recession also falling where you are. That's according to Goldman Sachs. So good news there. Germany, though, at the top. I put it there because that is in recession. It is, of course, Europe's biggest economy, so not great news. Its economy shrinking 0.3%. The UK there, the slowest growing, growth being the operative word here of all G7 countries. And now, unfortunately, forecast for a recession likely later this year. That's because inflation. Wendy, we've been talking about this for over and over and over for months. Right? Still more than 4 times the target of 2%, and more rate hikes are expected here, just like where they are, where you are.
And in travel news, U.S. travelers have European travel fever despite soaring costs for tickets and hotels, high inflation, 2 more rate hikes still expected. I was just in France. I was there for a week and a half, and definitely every other person there I thought was another American. It was actually astounding. I've never been to Europe and seen so many Europeans and so many Americans in Europe. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and it's going to get worse, more. Depends on who you are.
Your
if you're
perspective.
European. Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, this is also coming off of these sky-high prices that are going even higher. The average airplane ticket, get this, from the U.S. to Europe, is now at its highest in the past 6 years. So it's rebounded from the COVID era, from before the COVID era. It now costs around $1,100 per person. That's according to travel booking site Hopper. But it's not stopping people. Americans flocking and flocking and flocking. Check out the 5 most popular destinations for U.S. travelers on this map we've got for you here. Portugal, in the bottom left, is a top country to go to. Flights there from the U.S. are cheapest relative to all the other countries. And those are Spain, Italy, the U.K. here, meeting your money for sure. Greece, rounding out this group. Athens is the most popular European city for Americans. Also Barcelona and Rome. And you know, that bump, this travel bump, is giving a bump to travel stocks. I want to show you this other chart that I have for you here. Delta and United shares. Look at this. If you're an investor, up 40% or more so far this year. Carnival Cruise Line stock price has more than doubled, 115% just this past year. Advanced bookings there at a record. Marriott, you know, you got to stay someplace. If it's not maybe Airbnb or your friend's place, it's going to be at a hotel. Marriott shares up 23% there.
I got to look at my investments a little bit more carefully. These stocks look very good. And in China, there's surprise good news about China's switch to renewable energy. Wind and solar are booming. That's giving a bit of hope around carbon emissions and climate change. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, China's not only going to hit its green energy targets set for 2030, it's going to hit them 5 years early by the end of 2025. And what's worthy of note for this is that it isn't coming from the Chinese government. This is actually coming from a U.S. NGO called Global Energy Monitor that's based in San Francisco, and it follows the energy production around the world. The bar chart that we have here, just very quickly, China's going to more than double its solar and wind capacity in the next couple of years through 2025. The culmination of 20 years of economic and environmental planning. Wendy, I'll throw it back to you, and I'll just say that China is the world leader in terms of renewables. That's because it's so fast. It's able to go fast. If only a lot of other countries could go just as quick.
Rami, thank you.
You bet.
Just moments ago, the Supreme Court issued a major ruling involving President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. I want to bring in Danielle Douglas-Gabriel. She's a higher education reporter for The Washington Post. And let's also bring in Mark Kantrowitz. He's an expert on student loans and an author who has written several books on the subject. Mark, I know the decision is just coming in and we're really, really rushing to get it on the air. But what are you hearing in the first couple of pages? Because there's a lot more to come on this decision. What are you seeing?
Well, in the Brown case, the plaintiffs were found to not have legal standing. And it looks like in the Nebraska case that they've reversed the judgment of the district court and remanded the case back to them for further proceedings consistent with this opinion.
So can you explain what that means?
And then the government's application to vacate. It looks like they may have approved loan forgiveness. And I'm still reading, but it looks like the U.S. Department of Education might have won. I'd have to read it, though.
Yeah, we'll give you a little bit of time to catch up. Danielle, can you describe the two different cases?
Sure. So in the Brown case, there were two borrowers who had raised objections to the plan, one whom didn't qualify for the full $20,000 forgiveness because he had never received a Pell Grant for low-income students, so he'd only qualify for $10,000. The other borrower didn't qualify at all because she held a type of old bank-based loan known as FEL, and at one point, the department had let people with FEL loans consolidate their loans in order to be eligible for the plan. But in preparations, I think, for the legal challenge that they did receive eventually from Missouri and other states, the department cut off that eligibility. So folks could not consolidate their loans in order to take part, their FEL loans in order to take part in the program. And this borrower said that that was unfair and arbitrary. So she joined in this lawsuit with the other borrower.
All right, Mark. So it actually looks like we're all reading the same things here. Everybody who's doing this for a living, in other words, doing news on this particular story, is looking at SCOTUS blog and looking at the links that they're providing with the decision. And it does look that this plan has been struck down. President Biden's plan has been struck down. Are you? Is that how you're reading it?
I agree. So Brown lacked legal standing. This looks like it's been struck down. So a kind of split decision.
Guys, stand by briefly.
We're going to go to
stand by. We're just going to go to a CBS News special.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Nate Burleson. Breaking news out of the Supreme Court. The court just ruled that the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness plan is unconstitutional. The White House estimates the plan would have affected 37 million Americans and was set to forgive up to $20,000 in federal loans per qualifying borrower. The plan has been on hold since 6 Republican-led states who claimed the program violated President Biden's executive power took the administration to court. But the Biden administration argued the plan is permitted within the law and cited the HEROES Act, which allows the Secretary of Education to make changes related to student loans during national emergencies like the COVID pandemic. Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett is outside the Supreme Court. Chief, good morning.
Good morning, Nate, and welcome to the Supreme Court Plaza. As you said, in a 6-3 decision from the Supreme Court, writing on behalf of that majority, Chief Justice John Roberts addresses that question you raised right at the top, Nate. Did the HEROES Act, passed by Congress in 2003, give the Biden administration's Education Department the right to modify or amend that act to provide this student loan forgiveness? The court, through a 6-3 majority, says absolutely not. Let me read the main paragraph from the decision. The HEROES Act provides no authorization for the Secretary's plan when examined using the ordinary tools of statutory interpretation, let alone clear congressional authorization for such a program, meaning the court said Congress never intended for any administration to use the HEROES Act to waive all of this, or grant, rather, this loan forgiveness. What is interesting about this, Nate, is that this is an intent. No one has currently received any debt loan forgiveness. So the 37 million Americans who would benefit from this took out loans or received Pell Grants with the expectation they would have to repay them. That expectation that will now be realized yet again. There will be no forgiveness of this debt, even though the Biden administration argued strenuously before the court it had the right under the HEROES Act to do so, reading that law specifically, and the court said directly, it said it found no authorization for a debt forgiveness of this side. The financial implications of it, Nate, $400 billion, the estimated cost of this debt loan forgiveness, and about 16 million Americans would have qualified almost immediately to have their debt forgiven, at least in part or total. That will not happen, and the court has so ruled. Nate, back to you.
Major Garrett, we'll check back in with you on another Supreme Court ruling in just a bit. Thank you. Joining us now, CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Did any of the plaintiffs have the legal standing to bring this suit? In one case, the plaintiffs were 6 GOP-led states. In another, the plaintiffs were 2 student loan borrowers.
Yes, and that's how we got to the opinion that Major just described. If nobody had standing, then the student loan forgiveness program would have remained because nobody would have been able to challenge it. What the court said today is at least Missouri, through a public corporation named Mohila that it created to oversee the student loans, at least Missouri had standing. The court said, we don't have to look at the other states, and they proceeded to look at the merits. Exactly as Major said, they're looking at this 2003 statute, the HEROES Act, and they're looking at 2 very specific words, waiver and modification, and they're trying to figure out if this big student loan forgiveness program falls within either one of those words. And the court said today in a 6-3 decision by the chief, no, this is a big program. You need specific authorization from Congress. You can't try and shoehorn it into waiver or modification in the HEROES Act.
Jessica, thank you. Let's bring in Christina Ruffini at the White House. Christina, what's the reaction from the Biden administration?
Well, Nate, the administration was clearly prepared for this eventuality, and although sources at the White House say they strongly disagree with this opinion, the president, they say, will have more to say on this today. But just moments after that opinion came across, we received this statement. It says the president will make clear later today he's not done fighting yet and will announce new actions to protect student loan borrowers. It also says we'll be making it crystal clear to borrowers and their families that Republicans are responsible for denying them the relief that President Biden has been fighting to get them. And that last paragraph really goes to the crux of this. Look, President Biden said in November this was a campaign issue for him. He said he was going to do it. He did it. Nobody should have been surprised by that. And yet there was opposition from Republicans almost immediately to try to overturn that. And we saw that was successful today in the court. Look, the other issue here is one of the biggest borrowers, the biggest holders of student debt are black women. And black women voted overwhelmingly for President Biden. This was one of the things he wanted to do for his constituents, for these people who helped get him in office. So as we heard from the White House, the fight isn't over yet. But as we've seen with this administration, with a split Congress and with a conservative court, it is increasingly difficult for the Biden administration to take executive actions to try to make policy when it keeps getting bounced back by the guys in that big building a little bit down the road.
So what are the possible next steps for the president?
We'll have to see. They could try to do another executive action. You know, in those arguments, one of the justices mentioned this is something that really should come from Congress. But with a divided House and Senate, that seems unlikely. So it's unclear what recourses the White House will really have. But I guess we'll have to hear what the president says later this afternoon.
All right, Christina, we appreciate you. Seems like 1 in 8 Americans will have to restart those payments. The money they were saving for possibly cars or even homes will have to be put on hold if this is indeed the case. We'll check back in with you later. Let's go back to Major Garrett, who I called Chief a little bit earlier at the Supreme Court. Major, there was a big decision that was released today, another one as well. Let's get to that. What do we know?
So this case, Nate, was about the tension between First Amendment rights and LGBTQ rights in the state of Colorado. Lori Smith, who is a web designer, wanted to design websites specifically for marriages, but she only wanted to design those websites for heterosexual couples seeking to be married. She described herself as an artist. She said that these websites would be unique and artistic. And she wanted to post on her business, which doesn't exist yet but is aspirational, that she would not provide any of her web services, her creative web services, for same-sex marriage couples. The state of Colorado informed Lori Smith that she would be violating the state's anti-discrimination law. She sued because she said her First Amendment rights were being violated, and by a 6-3 majority written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, the court sided with Lori Smith, saying that that anti-discrimination public accommodations law in Colorado prohibits her from exercising her First Amendment right to say, I oppose same-sex marriage. Let me read to you a portion of Neil Gorsuch's decision and opinion. Quote, the First Amendment's protections belong to all, not just to speakers whose motives the government finds worthy. In this case, Colorado seeks to force an individual to speak in ways that align with its views, but deny her conscience about a matter of major significance. In her dissent, Sonia Sotomayor on the court said as follows, Today, the court, for the first time in its history, grants a business open to the public a constitutional right to refuse to serve members of a protected class. Again, the ruling 6-3, authored by Justice Neil Gorsuch, finding on behalf of Lori Smith, saying her First Amendment rights were violated to offer her opinion, saying her business services as a website designer would not be open to same-sex marriage couples. Nate?
Yeah, the question is on both sides of the coin. On one end, does this win allow a range of businesses to discriminate for a variety of reasons, or is it as simple as not forcing an artist to do work that is against their beliefs? Major Garrett, we appreciate you. Thank you. Now, a quick recap of today's other big decision on student loans. The Supreme Court has struck down President Biden's plan to provide student loan relief for millions of Americans, ruling it is not constitutional. Our coverage will continue with CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Nate Burleson here in New York.
And you've been watching a CBS News special report just moments ago. The Supreme Court struck down President Biden's plan to cancel up to $20,000 in student loan debt for millions of Americans. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll have so much more analysis coming up. Stay with us.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against?
I just worked harder. The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military when we go person to person.
Stories start with the who, what, when, and where.
CBS News has been following this story. Camilla, why is the government relying on these devices to track migrants?
But it's why it's important to you that matters most. Doctor, why are federal health advisors focusing on this specific pill for contraception? And knowing what to ask is how you open the door to a deeper understanding. I'm John Dickerson. See you on Prime Time. Streaming free everywhere.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
He started out as a fun-loving party boy, but the alcohol got the better of him. What I envisioned was him being in some sort of medical facility. I just thought, what a great candidate for them to learn about the results of alcoholism and what it does to a body. But his body was sold to the military, specifically used as a crash test dummy in the simulated Humvee explosion. I was devastated. I had the box. I don't know if they were his ashes or not. I just held it as tight as I could, and I just told him how sorry I was.
Body Brokers, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift, stream now on the free CBS News app.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education.
Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides, Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
After nearly 4 decades of March Madness, this sports broadcasting legend is stepping away from his role in covering the NCAA basketball tournament. Jim Nantz on his fondest memories and what's next when we go person to person.
We are following some breaking news out of Washington. The Supreme Court struck down President Biden's plan to cancel up to $20,000 in student loan debt for millions of Americans. Let's bring in CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett for more analysis of this ruling. Major, so break down the court's decision.
Vlad, good morning. Welcome to the Supreme Court and the plaza here. So the essence of this court decision, 6-3 majority, was this. Did Congress intend, through the 2003 HEROES Act, to give the Department of Education authority to forgive student loan debt? The court said no, it didn't. Didn't care whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, the economic benefits, the distributional effects. Was this Congress's intent? That was the central question the Supreme Court focused upon. And it's been made very clear by this conservative majority of the court that that's what it cares about most in questions of this nature. What did Congress intend, and did any administrative estate of any administration, Trump, Biden, or others, overstep that clear congressional intent? So let me read to you the most important part from the decision written on behalf of the majority by Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The HEROES Act, I quote directly, provides no authorization for the Secretary's plan when examined using the ordinary tools of statutory interpretation, let alone clear congressional authorization for such a program. Meaning, yes, the Department of Education under the HEROES Act at times of national emergency can change the terms by which student loans are repaid. The Trump administration did that during COVID pandemic by saying that you don't have to pay any of your student loan payments for a while. The Biden administration continued that. That was a minor modification in the eyes of the court. What the court said this act did not give the administration the power to do was forgive debt entirely, which is what the Biden administration said its interpretation of those powers was. It was a question about who had the power and how are you legally exercising it. And the court said this was an illegal exercise of executive power, therefore it overruled it.
And there was a second ruling from the Supreme Court. Can you describe that one for us?
Yes, it was a question about First Amendment rights and anti-discrimination laws, specifically in the state of Colorado. What were the facts of the case presented? Lori Smith is a website designer in Colorado, and she wanted to broaden her business to include website designs for couples getting married. But she only wanted to provide those, as she described them, unique artistic services to heterosexual couples. She had no intention, because of her religious convictions, to provide those, again, using her terms, unique artistic services for same-sex marriage couples. And she wanted to put an advisory on her website notifying them that she would not provide those services and directing them to other providers who might. Colorado informed her that if she did that, she would be violating the state's anti-discrimination law. Lori Smith sued, saying that her First Amendment rights were being violated, and the Supreme Court upheld her position, saying that this law did prevent her from speaking on her behalf on a major matter of significance to her, and said that she has the right to let people know that this is a service she will only provide to certain customers, in this case, heterosexual couples seeking to be married.
All right, Major, stand by. Let's bring in Christina Ruffini, who can give us the perspective from the White House. Christina, first to you on the question of President Biden's, one of his signature pieces of what he was attempting to do in this administration, that student loan forgiveness plan. What are you hearing?
Right. In the run-up to this decision, the president said, look, I campaigned on this. I ran on doing this. Everyone knew I was going to do it. It shouldn't come as a surprise. And yet we were seeing on this as this immediate Republican pushback that's coming from him. Now, obviously, the White House was ready for this eventuality because moments after the decision came down, a West Wing source sent us the following, saying we strongly disagree with this court, but the president will have more to say later today. Also adding the president will make clear he's not done fighting yet and will announce new actions to protect student loan borrowers. The source also said we'll be making it crystal clear to borrowers and their families that Republicans are responsible for denying them the relief that President Biden has been fighting for them to get. And that last part is really crucial because, as we mentioned, this was a campaign issue, and it was an issue that was important to a lot of people who voted for President Biden, including black women. More than 90% of black women who voted for the president. And black women also tend to hold the most student debt and with the highest balances. This is a key issue for the White House, and they said they're not done fighting it yet.
Two major Supreme Court decisions. Major, Christina, thanks so much. We're going to take a quick break, but we will have continuing coverage of these two rulings at the top of the hour. Stay with us.
what's important to our nation.
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
It's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
It can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable.
The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm here.
Fire and rescue is out. They're doing wellness checks because people are trapped inside their homes. How's the pay?
A lot better.
That's you and the Queen. That's beautiful.
An original documentary from CBS reports tensions rising between a powerful country and a vital island.
The supply of this technology came grinding to a halt. The world would grind to a halt. Absolutely.
As Taiwan faces threats and aggression,
Taiwan is on the front line, and we understand our responsibility as a democracy. We cannot fall.
CBS News examines whether they can defend themselves.
Putin, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, there are manifestations of the battle between autocracy and democracy. And that is a fight that we're all engaged in.
Defending Taiwan, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
Or you can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Why aren't you holding yourself to that standard? It doesn't look like Congress is doing anything. What are the risks that they're looking at? I think I asked direct questions. I don't know that they're tough questions per se. I think there are a lot of tough issues that our country is facing. Does this mandate make sense? That's the role of Face the Nation, to focus on the issues at hand. That means a civil, contextualized conversation with perspective.
CBS News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
After the tragic loss of beloved newsman Tim Russert, his son went on a worldwide journey to find himself.
I struggled with his grief for a long time.
How Luke Russert is honoring the legacy of his father when we go person to person.
It's just about 11 a.m. here. Not here, this is New York City, but in Washington, it's also 11 a.m. And that is where the Supreme Court struck down President Biden's plan to cancel up to $20,000 in student loan debt for millions of Americans. So joining us now is CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Let's also bring in Mark Kantrowitz. He's an expert on student loans and an author who has written several books on the subject. CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian is following all of this. And let's also bring in CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett for reporting from the Supreme Court. So, Jessica, to you, as the lawyer on this panel, what do you make first of this decision by the court to reject President Biden's plan for student loan forgiveness?
This is about what we predicted at the end of very lengthy oral arguments. The court said a couple of things. One, Missouri has the legal standing to sue through a public corporation called MHILA that essentially oversees that state's student loan program. And so the court found that MHILA suffered enough of an injury to allow Missouri to walk into the federal courthouse doors and assert that injury. Now, the second thing the court said is we're looking at this 2003 statute called the HEROES Act, and that's what would give the Secretary of Education the authority to implement this student loan forgiveness program. And the court's looking at two words, waiver and modification. And what the Chief Justice said for for 5 of his colleagues today is that those words, waiver and modification, they don't give the Secretary of Education the power to cancel student loans. And that the last thing the court really said here is, in order for the Secretary of Education to do this, he needs a clearer sign from Congress. He needs express authorization. And that's something called the Major Questions Doctrine that Vlad, you and I have been talking about for over a year now. That's essentially, those 3 points are the 3 big takeaways from today's student loan forgiveness ruling.
And Mark, you've been with us all morning long. Now you've had some time to read in. We're finally giving you some time. So any analysis from you?
So clearly it's a 6-3 decision against the president's student loan forgiveness plan. They found that Missouri has legal standing. They found that the HEROES Act does not authorize a major change. They bring in the Major Questions Doctrine in that regard, saying that Congress would normally reserve this for itself and that Congress has not succeeded in passing legislation for such broad loan forgiveness, and they're trying to make a very clear argument that the existing law supports their decision and that this is not an activist court. And the Major Questions Doctrine has been a fundamental principle for several decades now. It is not something that was created last year in the EPA case. It had existed back in the early 2000s when the court said that Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes.
Nicole, so we know that this plan by the president was pretty much split along partisan lines when it comes to Congress. What are you hearing for those in Congress who are happy with the court's decision and those who are disturbed by it?
Well, as you mentioned, for the most part, reaction thus far has been along those party lines. Keep in mind that this is really a significant victory for Republicans. I mean, yes, there has been this Supreme Court ruling, and people have been waiting for it. But keep in mind, prior to this ruling, Republicans really were trying to halt this program and, in fact, passed legislation to do as much. The president ended up vetoing it, and there weren't enough votes in Congress to sustain a veto override. But this has been a target of Republicans for some time now in terms of doing away with the president's student debt loan forgiveness program. So as you can imagine, people like Speaker Kevin McCarthy have said that, this ruling that the student loan giveaway, in his words, has been ruled unlawful. He goes on to say that the president must follow the law. You have other Republicans saying that they are relieved that this is a victory for hardworking taxpayers because, of course, many Republicans argued, why should debt be forgiven for some individuals when you have other individuals, for instance, who may not have gone to college but who have their own small business, and why should they be responsible for someone's debt? Or someone who has repaid their loans, why should that person be responsible for the debt of others? So that was really Republicans' main sticking point and issue with this program. They also just thought it cost too much, that it wasn't fiscally sound. And so, again, we have seen many attempts within Congress to try to do away with this program. Democrats, on the other hand, especially progressive Democrats who have been advocating and articulating for student debt loan forgiveness, are really upset and floored by this decision. For instance, we have Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who says that this was a disappointing and cruel ruling. He goes on to say that this shows callousness of, in his words, MAGA Republicans, characterizing the court as a MAGA Republican-controlled Supreme Court. So really strong language from the top Democrat in the Senate. You have others like Elizabeth Warren, leading progressive in the Senate, who says that, this fight isn't over, that she believes the president has more tools at his disposal. That is something that we have heard from other progressive lawmakers even before this decision and ruling came down. For instance, Congresswoman Cori Bush out of St. Louis suggested just within the past day that no matter how this ruling shakes out, that she believes that, it's up to the Biden administration to try to continue to make good on their promise to relieve student debt for millions of Americans. So in the view of Democrats, they don't see this fight as being over, even though it's a major setback. Republicans, though, I think feeling very vindicated with this ruling today.
All right, thanks, Nicole. Let's bring in CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett for more analysis. So what are the ramifications, the real-world ramifications for
Sure. The Biden administration said up to 37 million Americans would have benefited from this loan forgiveness program. About 16 million or 14 million by the Biden administration's estimates would have had all of their student debt eliminated. So that means there is an economic effect that might have occurred. It's important to point out no one had had their debt forgiven. It was blocked almost immediately after the Biden administration announced it. So everyone who took out these student loans or received Pell Grants did so under the assumption that at one level or another that debt would have to be repaid. That's exactly the situation they find themselves in now. The promise, the intent of the Biden administration to provide that debt loan forgiveness no longer exists. What is also true is come October 1st of this year, the forbearance that the Trump administration and the Biden administration provided during COVID expires. What was that forbearance? That you didn't have to make any monthly debt service payments and you would have no penalties assigned for not paying. So for a very long time in the Trump and the Biden administrations, no one has had to repay their student loans at all unless they chose to. That ends on October 1st. And that was going to end on October 1st regardless of this Supreme Court decision. One other thing that this majority's opinion clearly demonstrates, the composition of the court matters. What is a major decision and what falls under that doctrine matters depending on how the court is composed. And all three of the justices, the conservative justices appointed to this court by former President Trump, said in their confirmation hearings that they intended to be sticklers on matters of congressional intent. And if Congress didn't specifically authorize something and an administrative state, meaning an executive branch agency, under any administration, overstep that, they would rule against it. That's exactly what's happened here. They said so in their confirmation hearings. It is being applied in the real world right now.
All right, and Jessica Levinson, let me get your final thoughts here. Some of the politics involved in this. I mean, part of the reason why President Biden, as you know, campaigned on this issue is because, in his words, Congress wasn't acting. It failed to act. It failed to act at these ballooning student loan debt plans that young people were taking on. So what happens next?
Well, what happens next is that the Biden administration essentially has a choice. They can try to go back to Congress, which obviously they haven't had any luck in the past. And that would have avoided this whole question. If the student loan forgiveness program had been passed as legislation, not an executive act, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. The other thing is that there is another act, the Higher Education Act, and the Secretary of Education could try to do something similar, but under the Higher Education Act as opposed to the HEROES Act. That would require much lengthier rulemaking, and it would undercut the Biden administration's initial argument that they needed to do this because there was an emergency. But as I see it, those are the two tracks, basically another executive order through a different piece of legislation or trying to go back to Congress, which, again, politically speaking, I think would be extremely difficult.
All right, so that is the student loan decision. Let's do another round robin, beginning with Major Garrett to talk about the court's other big decision this morning, Major.
Yes, that decision deals with a question about First Amendment rights and an anti-discrimination law in the state of Colorado. Here are the basics of the case. Lori Smith is a website designer. She wanted to expand her website design business to include websites designed for people who intended to get married. But Lori Smith has a religious objection to same-sex marriage and wanted to put on her website an advisory that she would not, under any circumstances, use her creative, unique, artistic talents, those are her words, not mine, to design websites for any couple who wanted to be married who are of the same sex. Colorado advised her that if she did that, if she put that statement on her website, she would be violating the state's anti-discrimination law and public accommodations law. Lori Smith sued, saying that the state of Colorado, through that law, was preventing her from exercising her First Amendment rights. And the Supreme Court ruled in Lori Smith's favor today, saying that that law did inhibit her from exercising her free speech rights. What that now raises a question about is, can other businesses exercise other rights that could be viewed as discriminatory that are not specifically speech related? The court said there's no danger of that, but in dissent, Sonia Sotomayor said for the first time, this court has now given constitutional protection to discriminating against a protected class. She and others in dissent said this opens up an entire potential Pandora's box of other businesses using other discriminatory actions and covering them under the First Amendment rights now granted Lori Smith in this case.
Congressional correspondent Nicole Killian also is with us. Any reaction at this point from Democrats, Republicans, Nicole?
You know, there has been some. Obviously, you know, everybody's kind of processing the decisions as we are. So some are on student loans. Some are more specific to this particular ruling. I will note what Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said, which is that today's ruling by the MAGA right activist wing of the Supreme Court is a giant step backward for human rights and equal protection in the United States. He goes on to say that refusing service based on whom someone loves is just as bigoted and hateful as refusing service because of race or religion, which of course is certainly the main concern that some have with this ruling. Of course, others believe that, you know, that this website designer should be allowed to stand up for her principles. So once again, it is an issue that has kind of galvanized both parties along their respective ideological lines. And that is something that we have really seen with just about every major ruling that has come down from this court, certainly not just this week, but of course, even looking back to the last term. So I expect we will see more reaction kind of in that vein. But for now, that is just some of the reaction we are seeing to this other decision.
All right, Jessica Levinson, your take on the decision, and I'm curious what your reaction is to the dissent.
Well, I think the dissent has just an entirely different view of anti-discrimination laws, aka public accommodation laws, and what they protect. And the dissent is saying this is a very slippery slope, that we know why we have anti-discrimination laws. We've had them for decades. Unfortunately, they solve a very real problem. And we've now set ourselves off on a course where people can say it violates my religious beliefs to, and then fill in the blank, make a website, make a cake, photograph your wedding. And it is important to note, as we've continued to note, that this is a free speech case. So Lori Smith was a religious objector, but the case is based on speech rights. And so one can imagine that many sellers, and I think Major made this point, many sellers will say, well, part of my good or service is expression, and it violates my genuinely held beliefs to have to serve you. And that's really what the dissent is worried about, that many people can then say, I don't want to serve you. And again, the whole point of these state anti-discrimination laws is, one, we don't have a corollary on the federal level, so we rely on those state laws. The other is that if you want to walk into a store and you want a wedding website, or you want somebody to photograph your wedding, or you want a cake, that people will not say no because you are a certain race, a certain religion, or a certain sexual orientation.
Major, before we wrap up this discussion, and I know we've spoken about this throughout the term of the court, but I think as we look to the last day of the court's term, it does strike me that there has been a fundamental rewriting of American jurisprudence by this rightward-leaning court. Decisions on guns, on abortion, and now student loans and religious freedom or First Amendment expression of speech that are going to have ramifications for decades, just in the same way that Roe versus Wade affected the lives of all of us here. For the next 50, perhaps even longer, this is the way, this is going to be the American sort of life going forward. And it doesn't seem, for those folks who have been disappointed by some of the court's decisions, it does strike me that there doesn't seem to be a lot of recourse, at least not in the immediate term.
So, Vlad, I'm going to defer to Jessica, who's a constitutional law expert, on the larger ramifications and what the larger written intent of this court is. But to your point, This court is not at all bashful about changing the way America lives or has lived its lives if, in fact, it believes the way it has lived the lives under a previous court precedent, to their mindset, violate the Constitution. They did that with Roe versus Wade, said, sorry, we don't really care that the country has built up all of these expectations, practices, procedures around abortion. We don't think it's constitutionally permissible, therefore we're going to give it back to the states, and we're going to let the states decide that. And whatever the ramifications play at the state level, that's fine. We're not involved in that business. All we're involved in the business of is deciding what is or is not constitutional. In the case of student loans, this court said it's not in the law. And if it's not in the law, we're not going to permit it. And you can exert executive authority all you want, but if it's not in the law and it's challenged, we're going to strike it down. On affirmative action, the court was sort of in the middle, saying, you know what, yes, there are policies and procedures that even this court, in previous iterations and previously composed courts, said were constitutionally permissible. We no longer agree. So we're prepared not only to change policies and procedures and expectations in this country, we're prepared to change precedents established by this very own court, much like it did in Roe versus Wade, and do that without any fear of either political ramifications or outer constitutional criticism. That's what it means when you have a solid majority of one party or another within this court. And at a 6-3 majority, this court is clearly communicating to the country. It will exercise its authority under the Constitution and its reading of it, and all the ramifications will play out on the other side of that. But when they're asked these questions, they're going to take them on and answer them their way.
So let me, Jessica, get your thoughts on something that Major talked about. And I think it's, for me at least, I keep thinking that, well, first of all, we had President Trump yesterday taking credit for putting 3 of those justices, those conservative justices, on the court, which then echoes former President Obama's admonition that elections do matter. But then I think for the average American who watches the confirmation hearings of SCOTUS associate justices, where each and every time they stand there in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee and say, they talk about established precedents, that they're not going to upend decades and decades of established precedent. I think most people are going to say now going forward, you're full of it.
I think so, because these confirmation hearings are largely useless. As we've talked about, the name of the game is to appear that you know a lot without committing to any particular perspective or point of view. And that started all the way back in the 1980s with somebody who was nominated to the court by President Reagan, Judge Bork. And he was too honest. And he said, yeah, I have these views of executive power, and I have these views of when Congress can act. And people were quite frightened, to be honest. And ever since then, we have held people like Justice Ginsburg and Justice Kagan and Justice Roberts did a phenomenal job of this as the example of what to do in a confirmation hearing, which again is to commit to nothing while showing everyone that you know a great deal about the law. Now, who's the loser in that situation? It's the American public, because these are 9 people who have enormous power. They have lifetime appointments. They cannot be forced off the bench except for impeachment, which is exceedingly rare. And so we lose the ability to have a conversation with them before we empower them to make decisions that, as you were just talking about with Major, have huge implications over our lives.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I was just in high school when Judge Bork was nominated. But I recall the hullabaloo, of course, reading the newspaper. I was a news junkie back then, and it just struck me that in years previous to Judge Bork, and Major, you can weigh in on this as well, and Nicole too, if you have some insight. It did strike me that you would get bipartisanship decisions on justices to the Supreme Court. You'd get Republicans and Democrats coming together based on the responses that a nominee would give in the Senate chambers. And now it breaks down strictly along party lines, and it doesn't really matter what they say. If you have the majority, you're going to get your guy or you're the woman that you want in. Jessica.
So I think that's exactly right in the sense that it does feel like it's a fait accompli. Once you hit those Senate confirmation hearings, people have already counted up the votes and they've already determined whether or not somebody's going to be on the court. And the thing that they need to do is just make no mistakes. Now, Vlad, I hope to your point, we can also remember the confirmation hearings that weren't as long ago as Judge Bork's unsuccessful hearings of Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And she had that famous quote where she said, sometimes a wise Latina woman makes a better decision. And she had to really walk back that quote, frankly, in my view, and say that she would be a blank slate. And again, this is to our point of the justices, while they've been picked for their views, while they've been picked increasingly because we don't want any surprises like we had with Justice Souter, for instance, who kind of moved to the left, or Justice John Paul Stevens, who moved to the left. The name is to pick them because of their views and then have them in those 2 or 3 days espouse essentially no views. As you also noted, we are very, very divided in the Senate, and we don't have those big bipartisan confirmation numbers like we did even 15 years ago.
Very good points. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thanks to all of you for your insight on this case. We're going to take a quick break, but we will have continuing coverage of the Supreme Court rulings throughout the day. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.
If it's important to our nation,
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
it's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, oh, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News. An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
A jury acquitted a former sheriff's deputy accused of failing to act as 17 people were killed during the Parkland school shooting in 2018. Scott Peterson was found not guilty of felony child neglect and other charges. It was the first time a U.S. law enforcement officer had been charged for their actions or lack of action during a school shooting. Our Manuel Bajorquez has more.
The defendant is not guilty.
Former Florida Sheriff's Deputy Scott Peterson visibly shook as the jury in his trial cleared him of charges including felony child neglect, culpable negligence, and perjury. Peterson's friends, family, and legal team celebrate